In 2003, I ended up with bone cancer. There was no chemo, no radiation options available to me. I was terminal. I knew how I was going to die. I knew within a certain time span that I was going to die. That makes it very difficult to come awake at 4 o'clock in the morning and realize all of this is going to end.
This is the Home of Healthspan podcast, where we profile health and wellness role models, sharing their stories and the tools, practices, and routines they use to live a lively life. Welcome back to a lively episode of the Home of Healthspan podcast. And this is an episode I am very much looking forward to. I think we all have heard a lot about inflammation and its role in health, and especially inflammaging, I think has become a common term. And today we have an absolute expert, both scientifically and personally in the field. But Sam, before we jump in to your story, how you got here, everything that led you here, how would you describe yourself?
Well, I guess I'm a lively, awe-inspired scientist. I've always had this curiosity as to how the universe works from as far back as I can remember. And I didn't always have the answers. And it motivated me to go and seek out those answers to the questions that I had all during my life.
And I think for anyone watching this episode, as opposed to just listening, they will see the photo of Einstein behind you. So when you say a scientist, I mean, you really came at it from a scientific background. You've worked with NASA, you've worked with the Olympics and other realms. So I don't know if the adventure into health is as obvious as someone who just did pre-med, went to med school, kind of learned about the medical side of the field. I mean, when you say scientist, I think you're what people imagine as the hard science side of the things, and then really exploring that final human frontier of human health. So can you talk a little bit about that career trajectory? Because the scientist, I think of Adam Grant's book, Think Again. And he talks about these different roles that you could have of a prosecutor, a preacher. And he's saying, hey, the best way for us to learn and keep moving is to be that of a scientist, to keep questioning. And it sounds like that's something that you're naturally inclined to do that led to this journey you've been on.
I've done that, Andrew, since, like I said, very early on, from looking at leaves. Why are leaves green? That was one of the very first things, probably 8 years old. I couldn't understand why leaves were green. And it turns out later on in life that when I began to look at the colors of the rainbow, Roy G. Biv, and I found out that green is toxic to all things that appear green. Green is a poison wavelength of light. So when plants pick up the 7 colors from the sun, they reject or reflect green light. That's why we see it green. The reds, orange, and yellows are absorbed to heighten the antenna during the photosynthetic process. We see it with algae also. So I began to think a little differently. I thought in the negative of what we were actually observing. I operated from behind the curtain in a lot of these things. When I realized, for example, that leaves hate green light. And that's been since proven in even science projects where they try to grow plants under certain wavelengths of light. They all die if they're just exposed to green light. So the basis of my understanding was not exactly what do we observe and ask why, but why don't we ask why not on the backside of that. So a lot of my success was based on why not this. It's easy for people to design and create things that they observe and live in a derivative type of a world where you're derived by tinkering off of somebody else's invention. But I pushed it on the other side. I did things that no one else thought of. or or things that I imagined could be opposite of what we're observing. And so that sort of started my career. And to answer those questions, I ran into roadblocks. I didn't understand chemistry well enough. I didn't understand physics that well. I didn't, and to get involved in those sciences, you had to be very proficient in math. So in my background, I started out in chemistry because it was the most fundamental elements. And I recognized very quickly we only had two things in this entire universe to play with. It was mass or energy. That was it. So chemistry defined mass for me. And then physics defined the energy component that I was needing in the electricity, the magnetism, how does sound vibrate? What is the electromagnetic frequency? How do you manage those in your life? How important are they in the movement of mass atoms? And it turns out that chemistry is all electromagnetic with the electron orbitals making all the bonds. So mass and energy was it. So the curriculums that a lot of this is in hindsight, but there was a driving force to figure out all of those components, and they were all found in chemistry or physics. So I went and I received undergraduate degrees in chemistry and physics, and then went and got a 4-year degree, a BS in chemical engineering, which combined the engineering component of those two fundamental bases of scientific study. And started out in chemical engineering. I was going to go into nuclear engineering in the 1970s, and then 3 Mile Island hit, and that quickly changed. But I became very proficient in the nuclear engineering side. Went to work for a company called Union Carbide, who was in the nuclear field. They're also in the polymer field. So I went in to learn how to make polystyrene, polysulfone, bakelite, and how polymer kinetics and reactions happen. And I was very good at designing polymer reactors, mass polymerization reactors, suspension reactors. And I understood the kinetics very well. I could understand how the molecules moved in a molecular soup to give us the combined properties of what we needed. So in that part of that, which I didn't know at the time was going to be important, I became proficient in what's called free radical chemistry. Because free radicals are the initiators we use to make a styrene molecule stick to another styrene molecule, to stick to another, until we finally end up with this long spaghetti chain of organic materials called polymers or plastics. So I did that for quite a while. Then I went into research and development with a company called Air Products out of Allentown, Pennsylvania. Worked on polyvinyl chloride operations, manufacturing, and then went to the corporate headquarters and became a lobbyist in Washington for the Chemical Manufacturers Association. And that was during the mid-'80s. At that time, the hazardous materials regulations under Elizabeth Dole, she was the Secretary of Transportation at the time under Reagan. And I was asked to develop the DOT hazmat regulations, Title 49, Part 173. Then there's you've probably seen them going down the highway, the HC placards for hazardous cargo. And after 9/11, they were placed everywhere. For example, you couldn't drive a gasoline tanker in downtown Houston anymore. So there was a whole slew of things that came out of that. Well, during that period, in our company, we had 7 individuals who it took for when we developed in research a new product, it took up to a year for it to be identified, where we could identify the marking, labeling, placarding, what type of package could it go in, how do we ship it by air, how do we ship it by water. So and each person was a specialist. So the paperwork would all go to them. They would do their little tweaking, and then it would move on. It was in series. very inefficient. So I developed probably one of the first artificial intelligence systems in 1987 to interpret the federal regulations. And it was an eye opener for me. I could now do in 5 minutes what took a year to do. So when the paperwork came down from the business area, then we just plugged in the physical properties of the product. And within 5 minutes, I had all the marking, labeling, what kind of drums it could go in, what kind of trucks it could be transported in, how do you stow it on board an international shipment by water. So what normally took a year to do and 7 people, we could now do with one person in 5 minutes. From that point, I recognized the importance of being able to model and to understand a lot of these processes from the thought process.
Okay.
In a nutshell, after it was presented to the board of Air Products, when I went back to my office, they had fired those 7 people.
Ooh, okay. I mean, this is really relevant right now as people wonder with AI, what's it going to do for job displacement? It's not necessarily just not hiring.
It's real.
You're really getting rid of people. Yeah.
And Andrew, I've been asked that question a lot, and I can tell them that job loss is going to be a huge component for this.
Wow. Okay. So then that takes us through the 80s.
Yeah. And then in 1990, a gentleman that I met, Colonel Tony Wachinski, he and I worked on several projects together. He introduced me to an organization called the Lunar Outpost Commission. And that was in 1991 to 1994. And they were looking to have people come on board to see how do we get to Mars? That's the ultimate objective. So the obvious pathway was Earth to Moon, Moon to Mars. There was a lot of health and safety reasons why you do that. You're only 3 days from the moon. If something happens, you can get somebody back. But the big component was, and there were several of us that were working on it, and we really didn't know who was working on it. We were just given specific projects, and I had 2. My first one was to develop a way of generating electricity on the moon with no moving parts. The second one, and I could only use the natural resources of the moon. Then there's not much. The second one was, how do we install, from a construction point of view, laboratories and habitats on the moon that could be protected from the pretty severe radiation levels. There were 3, Kegers, LEPs, and SEPs that we had to deal with: cosmic radiation, low mass, high energy particles like helium nuclei coming off of the sun, traveling almost at the speed of light. And then there were SEPs. These are solar event particles. These were heavy nuclear, like iron, nickel, uranium, things that were generated in the sun, but they would come flying off in these plasma bursts and would approach very high velocities. These things would go right through you, right through the aluminum spacecraft, and pretty much destroy everything. If it wasn't for our magnetic field around the Earth, we would all be shotgunned to death by these particles. When I worked on the project for the generation of electricity, we found water on the moon in the southernmost crater. Pioneer 10, I think, is the spacecraft that found it. So the biggest economic component of going to Mars was the fuel. How do you get that much fuel to the moon, launched from the gravity of Earth to the moon? Well, it turns out the fuel is already on the moon in the form of H2O. All we had to do was generate electricity to crack the H2O into hydrogen gas and oxygen, and there's our fuel already on the moon. So that was something that was going to make, we thought, the Mars mission quite successful. So I developed knowing what's called, this was in physics, but a process called the Seebeck effect. The Seebeck effect is two dissimilar metals. If I take two dissimilar metals and twist them together on one end, and it's open on the other end, and I stick that in a heat source, I get a voltage across these 2 points. And that's called the Seebeck effect. It's where thermoelectric generators were developed from. And so I knew that. Very few people knew that, but I knew that. And I knew that I had to only use the natural resources of the moon. Well, there aren't many. The soil's called regolith, but there's no real heat source other than the solar radiation striking the surface. But where the sun's rays strike the surface, it's almost 400 degrees Fahrenheit.
Wow.
It's hot. But in the shade, it's minus 200 degrees Fahrenheit. So I had a temperature difference between sun and shade of over 700 degrees. That's hotter than a propane flame on your stove. So what I did is I created this polymer fabric, and I stuck 1 million of these little tips up through it. So think of it this way. You got copper, then you got aluminum. You got copper, aluminum, copper, aluminum. And I did that all the way down this big film. So I could roll the film up, but when they got to the moon, they would unroll it. Well, on the sunny side, the film itself created its own shade. So on the sunny side of that film, it got really hot, 400 degrees. It created its own shade. So in the shade, on the bottom junctions, the cold junctions, it was minus 200 degrees. So I would get electricity flowing through there based off of the electronegativities differences in those wires. So at the end, I had very high voltage and high amperage. So I could now put those ends into that water, and I would get hydrogen coming off of the positive side. I would have oxygen coming off of the negative side. So that was in a nutshell, that was it. And I really thought we were going to Mars. I was very excited about going. In 2004, the medical team gave us some very bad news. There's a factor in the evaluation of space travel called REID. It's called the Reid factor. And what it stands for is the risk of imminent injury or death. And that number has to be under 3% for any space launch. And that's why the shuttle program was shut down, because they exceeded that with the shuttle losses. So that program ended. Well, when we did the evaluation of the Mars mission with what we knew and how we were going to get there and the distance and the time and the radiation exposure that the astronauts would be exposed to, it came in excess of 6%. So we knew no one could survive the mission to Mars.
Well, sorry, when you say 6%, why would no one, I guess I need to understand what that 6% means. So that doesn't mean if you sent 100, 94 would make it, but 6 wouldn't. 6% somehow is going from some to zero.
No, it meant that you only had, you had a 94% chance of survival, but NASA's standard was 97.
It's interesting though, because I mean, the people that volunteer for it, because if you put it in context of the explorers to the New World, or Lewis and Clark, or Shackleton with Endurance going to Antarctica, you know, they had 3% chance of survival. Like it was an inverse. And so there's a question of, if people know what they're getting into, are we being too paternalistic, or is it a optics thing?
It's a liabilities issue.
Yeah. Okay.
The lawyers got involved. There wasn't any lawyers on Christopher Columbus's ship.
Yeah.
And Magellan sailing around the world wasn't insured by Lloyd's of London.
Sure.
So times have changed a little bit.
Yeah.
Right now, no one will survive the trip to Mars. The spacecraft is designed improperly. It cannot be a cylinder. It can't be made out of aluminum. The Kegers, Leps, and Seps will go right through an aluminum. So if you have a particle coming pretty close to the speed of light, hits the structure, the aluminum structure of the spacecraft, on the backside, it's like a shotgun blast. So all of that energy throws all these tiny little aluminum particles like a mist traveling close to the speed of light. The momentum remains the same. So those aluminum, it's called spatter, but the aluminum particles will go right through any human being. You have enough of those holes drilled through you at the atomic level, and it creates an inflammatory problem. You have these internal wounds that now your body has to heal and try to fix. Now, it's going to take us a year to get to Mars, a year on Mars, and a year to return. So you have 3 years of exposure to these. And at this point, from what we've seen with the space station still inside some of the protection of the Van Allen belt, they're still suffering from these types of problems. A 3-year mission, no one survives. The risk of imminent injury or death is almost 99%. So I'm not, at this point, convinced that we can even make it to Mars and return. It could be a lot of people are going to die on the way there because these inflammatory diseases kick in about 2 to 3 months after you exit the magnetic field protection of the Earth.
And these inflammatory diseases, are these similar or the same to ones we experience living on Earth? They're just more accelerated and higher likelihood because of that exposure.
What I found was that there's 4 free radicals that cause 92% of all human disease. They're singlet oxygen, there's superoxide, the peroxyl, and the hydroxyl free radical. As a group, there's also a couple nitrogen-based free radicals, but I'm not going to talk about those right now. But those 4 are the major ones. And they're categorized in a group called ROS, ROS, reactive oxygen species. Those are the precursors to all disease. Now, the best analogy that I have is a very large oak tree. So this oak tree has its roots based down in the ground. That root structure is what initiates the production of these ROS. So that's diet, that's environmental pollution, radiation, alcohol, smoking, epinephrine, norepinephrine, and cortisol, the stress hormones from our adrenal gland. It can be wounds, it can be bacterial, it can be virus in causes of that. So you have this root structure down in the ground, and all these things that we live around or in or we take, they generate up the trunk these 4 free radicals. So think of the trunk as the ROS. Now, if that ROS builds enough, you end up with these big branches that we call disease. Right? So you got type 2 diabetes as a result, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, cancer, heart disease, MS. Well, doctors only treat the tips. Once the symptoms happen, they only treat the tips of those branches. And that's how our health program and industry is based right now. The problem is the trunk of that tree. Somebody needs to cut that trunk down. So this is sort of after an explanation of how I actually got into it. But from a strategic point of view, if I can eliminate the trunk of the tree, all the branches fall away. There's no more disease. So all I had to do was eliminate those 4 free radicals. And how I got there, now it's like Paul Harvey. I'm going to tell the rest of the story.
Yeah.
It wasn't supposed to happen to me, but I developed electromagnetic pulse weapons, auditory weapons, and bioweapons for a group out of Brooks Air Force Base. So in 2003, I'd also developed, I've got 44 patents that are pretty applicable throughout the world. I've built wastewater treatment plants in China, in the UK, about 27 facilities here in the United States. And in 2003, I may have gotten a little too close to something, but I ended up with bone cancer. And it was incurable. There was no chemo, no radiation options available to me. So it was a little shocking, to put it mildly. And I had a wonderful career. I had a wonderful life. I thought I was in control of everything that I was doing. And then this hit me, and I was terminal. I knew how I was going to die. I knew within a certain time span that I was going to die. And that makes it very difficult to come awake at 4 o'clock in the morning and realize all of this is going to end. Nobody's escaping. So once I realized that, and at that point had said, well, God, I'm out. I'm done. There's no other place for me to go. And some people call it a surrender. Some people say you just gave up. Well, my life changed from that point. There was no more fear in my life. It ended. I realized how insecure fear makes somebody. And if you're no longer afraid of dying, what other is there to fear? And so one very dark morning, I had gotten up and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, trying to figure out, because I knew I was going to stroke. I was going to either throw a blood clot to my brain, my heart, or my lung. I was probably going to be disabled. My family was going to have to take care of me if I didn't die outright. So I knew I had to think about things that people shouldn't have to think about. And the moment I reached that point of just nothing, it was a very peaceful but low point of my life. I sort of popped up and said, what's my purpose? What am I still doing here? And why can't this cancer be cured? And I began to ask these questions. And then there was one answer that came back was everything that God gave us, he put here on this earth. And if that's the case, then there's got to be some animals that don't get cancer, or some plants or something. So I had access to ProQuest, which was a government database at that time. So I queried it and asked for the identification of all the animals known to date that don't apparently get cancer. Well, it listed 5: salmon, pink flamingos, sharks, elephants, and naked mole rats. And at that time, I had asked a friend of mine who works at Scripps Oceanographic if he could do a mass spec and find those molecules that shouldn't be in any of those animals and yet is found in all 5 of those species. And he came back and he said, yeah, there's one. It's called astaxanthin. I said, what's astaxanthin? He said, well, it's a carotenoid made by an algae called Haematococcus pluvialis. So I went to the University of Texas and I got that Haematococcus pluvialis algal species and went out and bought, I call them hillbilly hot tubs, but those blow up Intex hot tubs that you can get. So I went and got one of those, and I had my family on edge because where I lived in Houston, we had a pool, and every day I had to go out and kill the algae in my pool. And yet here I am now. I have an algae reactor where I'm growing algae right beside my pool. And people were saying, what are you doing? You're trying to kill algae in your swimming pool, but you're growing it prolifically in this little tub. I said, yeah. So I learned how to make the algae produce this astaxanthin very efficiently. And it was just a little trick because the algae itself is green. But I knew if I could stress the algae, make it think that it's dying, it would produce this carotenoid. And the University of Texas helped me with that pathway. But they didn't have a way of really stressing it other than sunlight. So they would do phototoxicity of the algae, and the algae would get too much UV and it would turn red. But I didn't want to do that. So what I did is increase the salt concentration. I made the algae think that its pond was drying up. So the way that it would act is if its pond's drying up, the salt content would increase. And that triggered the algae then to start producing this astaxanthin, thinking that it's going to die when its pond dries out. And that's what happened. Within 48 hours, I could turn the entire green algae biomass into a red, deeply red, slimy algae.
Okay.
So I would float it out and skim it off, put it in a dehydrator, and I knew it was 3.8% astaxanthin at its reddest. So if I wanted to dose myself my first dose was 4 milligrams a day, I could calculate how many grams of this biomass do I have to eat to give me 4 milligrams. And since it was so red, and my past history, things that are red are usually poisonous, like red tide and red berries. Those are things you stay away from. So I figured that this was probably going to destroy my liver or my kidneys. There was something bad was going to happen. So I did a low dose, 4 milligrams a day. I began eating it. And within about a month of that, to keep me alive while I had my cancer, I had the cancer in 2003. This didn't start until about 2006, early 2007. So for about 4 years, I was phlebotomized every month. I would go in and they'd take my blood out. That's the only way they could keep me alive. So my phlebotomies was once a month. So when I started taking 4 milligrams a day, my phlebotomies got pushed out. The slope of the climb out of my hemoglobin dipped down. So I was being phlebotomized about once every 2 months. Statistically, it wasn't significant, but at least it wasn't killing me. My A1C came in line. My blood work began to normalize, except for my hemoglobin. And I thought, okay, my liver enzymes, AST, ALT were fine. My glomerular and renal counts were fine. So I said, okay, at 4 milligrams, I'm perfectly fine. It's not killing me. And I'm seeing some positive effect. So I bumped it to 12 milligrams a day. And when I did that, my phlebotomies got pushed out to once every 4 months. So now I had 3 slopes of the curve. I had the control. Every 30 days, I had to be phlebotomized. Then I had it at 4 milligrams. Every 2 months, I had to be phlebotomized. And then at 12 milligrams, every 4 months, I had to be phlebotomized. So I had the derivative, the slopes of those curves. So now I could calculate how much do I have to take so that I'm never phlebotomized for the next 50 years of my life. And it turned out to be 96 milligrams a day. I started taking 100, and my cancer went away in 30 days.
30 days.
No more phlebotomies. Haven't been phlebotomized since 2008.
That's one amazing. Like, congratulations. Mm-hmm. And so happy 22 years after the diagnosis that you're still here and we're having this conversation.
Well, yeah. I mean, the doctor came in when and told me I had polycythemia vera. I said, well, how much time do I have? He said, in your current condition, you have 10 minutes to 10 years. He said, 97% of the people will perish within 10 years. I said, well, what about the 10 minutes? He said, your blood is so thick that you could throw a blood clot to your brain, your heart, or your lung right now. It would take me 10 minutes to declare you dead. So that was my first phlebotomy.
Most corporate wellness programs overwhelm employees with too much, or they offer too little to be useful. A Lively gets it right. We start with each employee's data and goals, then serve one clear, personalized action at a time. No noise, just real behavioral change. The outcome? A healthier, happier workforce and measurable impact for your business. Visit alively.com to see personalized wellness in action.
You talked about your hemoglobin A1C. You said got in line. So you've developed this now for people to be able to take, because we've gotten here in different ways. We talked about the free radicals. Now we're getting in the antioxidants, and then this high dosage of this one very specific produced from the algae. What other objective metrics as people take this, right? Do healthy individuals take it, and what impact or benefits do they see?
As a biochemist, I had all the tools in the toolbox. If anybody could figure out the exact reason why this worked, I truly believed that I could figure this out. So it took me 8 years. It wasn't something that I could figure out right away. But I had family friends who were dying of cancer and home with hospice. So I began just to produce it and give it to them, and their cancers went away. Hospice left, and they're still alive today. You'll see some of the testimonies on the website. So what I found was these 4 free radicals. And there's a biochemistry course right there that I teach. In that book, this is not clinical stuff. This is textbook. In that book, it talks about the importance of these free radicals in the communication between cells and how they're produced in the mitochondria. So all of a sudden, I now knew the hydroxyl free radical was the one I focused on because it had the longest half-life and seemed to have the greatest affinity to react with the guanine of the DNA to cause mutation. And it did. So there was a whole bunch of articles that was listed, research papers published as to how the hydroxyl free radical causes DNA mutation. Well, cancer is a DNA mutation. So when I began to look at the chemical pathway as to how the astaxanthin donates or reacts from a free radical point of view and donates an electron to an OH, an oxygen hydrogen, with a 0 charge. Now, an oxygen has 8 protons, hydrogen has 1. So that's 9. Well, the OH radical has 9 electrons to match up with the 9 protons. So it's electrically neutral. So up at the top valence, we put a 0. It's neutral. The problem is, on all free radicals, all the orbitals, electrons in those orbitals have to be paired. Mm-hmm. With a free radical, one isn't paired. So it's highly reactive. It will steal an electron from anything that it bumps into. So it's very electrostatic. It's looking for an electron. If it bumps into a perfectly folded up protein, steals an electron, the electronic configuration of that protein changes and it'll open up and misfold. It's called misfolding. So I knew that chemistry. So now I had these 4 free radicals that I knew were being impacted by the astaxanthin, by its ability to donate electrons without itself becoming a free radical. And that's why astaxanthin is one of the only products that doesn't become a pro-oxidant. Vitamin C is great on inflammation, but when it's processed in the liver, it generates all these hydroxyl free radicals again. So a large dose vitamin C, a lot of other things will go ahead and throw these free radicals back out into your system and can become quite inflammatory. And we see that with high dose vitamin C causing non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. That's where it's coming from. Alcohol does the same thing. Fructose in fruit does the same thing. So when I began to look at the astaxanthin, all of a sudden, all four of these free radicals, as they're produced in the mitochondria during the metabolic pathways, they immediately would neutralize it. Well, when we're young, we can do a lot of stupid things without generating these free radicals. We can eat a lot of pizza, we can eat carbohydrates, we can eat sugar, we can stay up late, we can drink beer, we can drink alcohol, stress ourselves. So why don't young people get these diseases? So I went back in and looked at the glutathione on the red blood cells versus a test called an HSCRP. HSCRP is a high sensitivity C-reactive protein. It's a protein generated by the liver when there's chronic inflammation. Chronic inflammation is what causes these diseases, and that measure is a measure of the concentration of these free radicals. So if the free radical concentration is very high and they're not being neutralized, your HSCRP will go out the roof. So when I took the blood samples from a 5-year-old all the way up to a 105-year-old, and I plotted the glutathione levels versus the HSCRP, well, young people are producing a lot of glutathione, superoxide dismutase, catalase. These are all cellular antioxidants. So when we're young, we're producing a lot of these. Then in women, at age 42 was the average, we begin to see it uptick. The HSCRP began to increase and the glutathione levels were dropping off fast. And now you get these inflammatory disease, these age onset inflammatory diseases. So now I had the link to show the correlation between the HSCRP and the glutathione levels. Nature cuts off glutathione. It can only be produced at intracellular, inside the cell. You can't take glutathione orally. You can't get it into the cell. And it's typically either lysine, leucine, tyrosine. Those are all amino acids that have to be present in the cell to produce glutathione. There's a sulfur-based amino acid also. But when the glutathione levels drop, your inflammatory disease state begins to go out of control. We start getting arthritis in our joints, waking up, our fingers are stiff. For men, it happens at about age 50. So we have about an 8-year jump on women. But their ankles, they begin to retain water. Their kidneys aren't functioning properly. And it's all inflammatory related. When that happens, eventually, you're going to present with a more serious disease. And everybody presents differently. Some people will present with chronic arthritis, osteoarthritis, irritable bowel syndrome, diverticulitis, diverticulosis, the coronary artery disease. It's not caused by cholesterol, never has been caused by cholesterol. What causes it is a free radical. The OH, zero charge, has an acidic pH, a pH of about 5.2. Well, when it is running through your bloodstream, your blood's trying to maintain a pH of 7.35, but it will irritate the endothelial cells that line your artery, and it will burn them. It will create a wound at that point, and that endothelial cell will die. And the moment it dies and bursts open, the white blood cells, the basophiles, go there and try to clean up the mess. Well, it forms a scab. So we use cholesterol to form the scab. That's what causes heart disease.
So it builds up, but why it builds up is because of, okay.
So this whole concept of cholesterol is bad for you is hog crap.
No, you need the cholesterol to do the healing. The issue is the damage that requires the healing in the first place.
Correct. And that's the hydroxyl free radical. If we can eliminate that, no more heart disease. In 2023, February of 2023, Dr. Stefan Kais, and people can look him up. He's a world-renowned cardiologist. He's the guy who invented the practical use of the very first stent ever put into a human being to save his life. He's number one cardiologist in Poland, very highly ranked here in the United States. He runs the Heart Institute in San Antonio. I think he even teaches or taught at Baylor for years. Well, he contacted me. We have known each other for a while, and he had contacted me and asked if, because I'd been on Velasta longer than anybody else probably on the planet, he said, would you come into my cath lab, and we want to go in and look in your arteries and see what kind of inflammation or plaque you have building up. As a 70-year-old, I should have plaque built up if it's a normal distribution of 70-year-olds. And I had no symptoms. My wife and I struggled with, do we do this? Well, we decided to do it. So we went in first day, fill out paperwork. If they kill us, we don't have any liability to sue them. There's a whole bunch of legal paperwork you have to fill out.
Yeah.
So day 2 was stress testing and scanning. And he was extremely thorough. He did Doppler of the arteries. He did CAT scans. He knew exactly what to do. And that went on all day for both of us. And then the next day, I went in at 6 o'clock in the morning, and I'm laying there and I'm wide awake. And he stuck the catheter in, went up through my wrist. And I'm watching it on a screen. I'm seeing the catheter in there, and he injects the radionucleotide, lights up my heart. Now, he told me before he went in, if he found anything, he would fix it. And I said, okay, well, it lit up. There's all my arteries beating around my heart. I mean, it was something to watch. Sort of exciting. Yeah. I didn't have any feelings or anything, no pain, nothing like that. And he looked in my heart area, and I believe he may have even gone up into the carotids and looked to see if there's anything there. So I come out of that, and I go back into the recovery room, and he comes in, he throws the curtain back, and in his Eastern European twang, he says, I don't believe this. I said, what's going on? He said, you want the good news or the bad news first? I said, give me the good news first. He says, the good news is you have no atherosclerosis at your age. Your arteries are as clean as a 20-year-old. He said, I have no patients. I have 56,000 patients. I have no patients at your age that have clean arteries like this. And I thought, well, that's pretty good news. I said, what's the bad news? And he comes over with his little video, and he says, I want you to look at this. Tell me if there's something strange here. So I began to watch it, and I could just see my arteries flexing with every heartbeat. He said, yep. He said, but I want you to look right here. And here is my LAD, the widowmaker artery that goes around your heart. Every heartbeat, it would kink and cut the blood supply off to my heart. In essence, giving me a heart attack with every heartbeat. And I said, that looks like a worm. He said, every time your heart beats, it did that. And I said, well, what is that? He said, that's a congenital heart defect. You've had that since you were born.
Wow.
And I said, well, can you fix it? He said, oh, no. He said, there's nothing to fix. He said, I just want you to know that if you'd have had a blood clot, that's called a widowmaker. If you'd have had a blood clot hit at that kink, you're dead. Your whole life, you've been playing on this edge. Yeah. If you'd had any plaque formation, which is where it forms, is in that kink, that's where it would have hung up, and you would have died within minutes. And I said, oh my golly, I said, can you fix that? He said, no. He said, we're not going to fix that. I said, well, how long can I live with that? He says, how old are you? I said, I'm 71. And he sort of looks up like this, and he goes, well, he says, I'll give you another 30, 35 years.
Okay.
I said, I get it. I understand.
Yeah.
And he sort of smiled and walked out of the room. And then my wife, she volunteered also, and her cholesterol runs about 260 for the last 20 years, untreated. Never had any treatment for it. And he came in and he said, now we'll probably find something on her. That's difficult with current understanding to have a cholesterol that high without having some atherosclerosis or blockage or plaque formation. So she went through the same thing. She went in. She came in and he come running in again and threw that curtain back. And he said, and used an expletive. And he said, I don't believe this. And he said, you have no plaque formation anywhere in your body. And I was sort of shocked too, because I thought they'd find something. And he said, this is highly unusual. He said, I could explain it being genetic if you two were related. And I said, well, no, we're not from West Virginia or Arkansas. No, I don't think we're related.
Yeah.
And he said, you have no atherosclerosis either. And he called his entire staff over and told every one of them to get on Valasta tomorrow morning. He now prescribes it to his patients.
And what is the dosing? So you were taking 100 when you were trying to treat a terminal cancer.
I still do 100.
Okay. And is that the recommended for a healthy?
No, we have to play a little bit of economics in this too. So if you are treating for a disease, we want to get every cell in your body saturated as quickly as possible, because that's where these ROS are generated, is in the mitochondria in every cell. So we look at your body weight. That translates to the number of cells you have in your body. So we're able to look at your body weight, and we've been able to figure out that if you have a disease, we want 1 milligram for every pound of body weight. So that's what we start people with as the baseline dose. And then we measure their HSCRP before they start the dosage, and then we monitor it. So if someone's in a disease state, if it's inflammatory, their HSCRP will be extremely elevated, greater than 10. And so we'll measure that. Then we put them on the Valasta, and for the next anywhere from 2 weeks to 4 weeks, we'll test the HSCRP again, and it should be trending down. If it's not trending down, then we'll increase the dose until we break over. Because what we found is that there's two things. There's a rate of generation of ROS that's not being neutralized, but there's also an inventory, a big tank full of ROS.
You have to clean out.
So depending on how we have to drain that tank dictates the time and what our dose is. So we start the baseline. If the HSCRP moves down, then we can monitor it and possibly start reducing the dose. If the HSCRP remains the same or elevates, that means that we got to increase the dose. That person in their lifestyle is generating a huge concentration of ROS.
And is this prescribed, or is this?
It's all natural. It's the only natural product that's ever been allowed to be patented. So we have 2 patents on it. The first one is that the title, which really surprised me that it was even allowed to go through the government agency, but it's a method for the process of using astaxanthin for the treatment of inflammatory disease, particularly for the treatment of cancer. Now, the FDA usually doesn't allow that type of verbiage, a press, to be used, but they did in this case. The second patent is for the mitigation of radiation for space travel. So astronauts are going to be taking it. We have special forces operators who are taking it. We have now going into horses for the removal of lactic acid for racehorses.
Oh, wow.
And that last furlong in a horse race dictates what horse is going to win. depending on how fast they generate lactic acid in their muscle tissue. So if I can stop that from forming, these horses are going to go start winning races.
Interesting. And for listeners that want to learn more about astaxanthin and everything, what's the best way for them to do so?
Velasta.net. All the testimonials are on there. The NIH, there's over 1,000 peer-reviewed articles on astaxanthin now on that website. I testified in Washington, D.C. in April of 2019. There were a bunch of senators, representatives that were there. The 5 major hospitals, Johns Hopkins, Sloan, MD Anderson, Mayo, and the Cleveland Clinic were all present. They were shocked that we had found what actually causes human disease. And I was approached and was and told that they were going to allocate funds through the NIH, I think to prove me wrong, which is okay from a scientific point of view. In some cases, that's the best way to do it. It's called the null hypothesis. But I volunteered to help. They didn't have to pay me or anything. And they told me that, no, I just need to go away. So it's an unbiased research program. Well, since then, you can now go on and Google NIH and astaxanthin and a multitude of diseases, cancer, heart disease, arthritis, type 2 diabetes. It doesn't work on type 1, irritable bowel, Alzheimer's, dementia. And all these research papers are now available for people to review and for their doctors to look at as the positive aspects of this. On the website, there's 2 approaches we make specifically for Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and dementia. The first one is people who have the disease already have amyloid beta plaque that's sort of plated out in their brains around the neurons. And for that, we developed an electromagnetic pulse, a light pulse I can send through the eye. And it came out of electromagnetic pulse weapons development, but it sends a very specific light into the eye. The eye is very good at converting photons of light into electricity. That's what the rods and cones do. So it sends the electric pulse back the optic nerve into the occipital lobe of the brain, and it dissipates and it activates a little organelle called microglia. And microglia have no DNA in them. They live forever. They're like an immortal cancer cell. It lives in our brain, swings through the neuronal forest looking for debris that it can eat. So it cleans up bacteria, viruses, dead bodies on the battlefield, cells that have died, and it cleans up the mess. Well, as we age, the microglia goes into hibernation and gets lazy. And that plaque will start to accumulate around the neurons in our brain, and they don't get removed. And that's what causes Alzheimer's. MIT figured it out. So we activate the microglia to clean up the mess that's there. And then you take Velasta that stops the misfolding of the amyloid beta protein so you don't get the reaccumulation of it.
It's amazing.
Interesting technologies.
Yeah, it's incredibly exciting space to be. And hopefully this is the first of many conversations. It just seems like it keeps expanding what it can do or what it is doing, and we're learning that it's doing, I guess is a more accurate way to say it.
Well, keep in mind, Andrew, that when I started this in 2008, I didn't tell anybody what I was doing because nobody was going to believe it. So I gave it just to those in need. So those who had 2 to 4 months, 3 to 6 months to live, we gave it to them. And sure enough, within 30 days, the doctors were shocked. They couldn't find cancer in these people. So if you're cured of cancer, you tell 100 people. Well, those 100 people, they're all in the same group.
Right.
And it went completely around the world. We now have offices in Dubai, Singapore, in Poland, in Denmark, UK. It went completely around the world with no sales or marketing, just by word of mouth and the social media.
Yeah. It's amazing. I'm excited to learn more, and I'm grateful that what seemed like a winding path, to me, it's very much like a prayer for Owen Meany or something, where they say, life only makes sense when looked in the rear view mirror, but you live it going forward. So you don't know each of these pieces as you go, how perfectly they'll fit together for your purpose, and then what that compounds to be in the impact. But we're seeing it, and that's only going to amplify from here. So Sam, thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrew, for having me and giving at least the opportunity for people to have hope, because current medicine isn't giving it to them.
No, and this is the difference, right? To get to the trunk, it's not about sick care. Health is too often associated with sickness, and this is about getting to health
and maintaining your health.
Yeah.
Yeah. I have nothing. I'm 73 years old. I have no arthritis. I lift weights. I walk 2 or 3 miles a day. I'm now developing ultracapacitors to replace lithium iron phosphate batteries. That could be another podcast we want to do. We're currently building drones. We get one chance to live this life.
Yeah.
And it's for living.
It's for living, and it's for exploring. I mean, the scientific mindset, that curiosity, I think we're all the beneficiaries of people like you that lead the way, not asking what necessarily has been, but what could be and why not. And so thank you for all your work and your time today.
Thanks, Andrew.
And to all our listeners, enjoy a lively day. Thank you for joining us on today's episode of the Home of Healthspan podcast. And remember, you can always find the products, practices, and routines mentioned by today's guests, as well as many other Healthspan role models on alively.com. Enjoy a lively day.